after 2 weeks, you came back. I'm very impressed. I'm impressed with you. I don't know about me, but I'm impressed with you. So, I hope everyone had a wonderful Thanksgiving and had much to be thankful for. Amen. And we have much to be thankful for in gathering this evening, that we are here, that we are in the presence of God. And so we pray in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Loving and good God, we give you thanks and praise for all of your many gifts to us. The gift of your Son, our Lord Jesus, who shows us your love. The gift of your Spirit, who moves in our hearts and in our lives. The gift of faith. The gift of community. The gift of your call to follow after you. We ask your blessings upon us this night, that as we learn of those who have gone before us, we may draw closer to them, to you, and to each other. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, again, welcome back. And as you may recall, this is now the third little bit of our history of Franciscan history in the United States. And as you also probably, I gotta get the right thing here. As you recall, we talk about this study of history as a conversation with people, primarily people who have been to places that we can never go to. That is, they've been to the past, or they lived in the past. And so we can never go there, but we listen and we search out and we seek their voices. But sometimes the conversation is with people that we see face to face. And that's what happened to me last time we met, right after class. Someone came and helped me tremendously by letting me know I had goofed. In this picture, in this slide, where I was talking about the Franciscan sisters who came because of the Kulturkampf, I had, these are sisters who all came between 1875 and 1880. I mean, they came primarily because they were driven out of Germany, just like the friars and other religious were driven out of Germany. But among them also was Mother Mary Veronica von Elmensdorf, who came from Dusseldorf at Port Clare. And when I was talking in my conversation, in my speaking, I didn't make it clear that those were not the only Port Clares. We also have this is the ones that came from Dusseldorf. So this is Mother, where is she? Where is she? Mother Mary Veronica von Elmendorf. And she was there, she came because of that, but they were not the only ones. This is what I'm trying to get to. That there were also the Mantivolio Sisters who came, and they were sent by the Pope. So they were not coming from Germany. They were Italian. They were Italian. One of them was a countess, and then her sister Magdalene, or Constance and Magdalene, came to America. This was the Pope's idea that they start Port Clares in America too. So it was almost simultaneous. They both got here. Both Port Clares got here in 1875. Both sets of Port Clares. But there were two of them, and I didn't make that clear, and I apologize for that. I want you to, it's also a reminder. You're looking at a very fallible teacher, and so you need to improve my teaching by letting me know when I make mistakes, letting me know things like that. So that's where we are. That's part of my story, if you will. I can't get my finger there. That's part of my story, is that I make mistakes. That's it. But also we're talking about our story, the story of Franciscan men and women in the United States basically since the 1800s, and the story is God at work for the salvation of the world. And that happens, we hear the story by listening to my story, by listening to our story. And we understand my story and our story by knowing they are part of the story, that we are all connected. that our conversations reveal the stories behind us, the stories of who we are. So that's a big part of what we're talking about, just to keep that back in mind, that we're here to hear stories and to tell stories and share stories in this conversation. And one of the things that we're going to find out, why is it not, it's not, it doesn't want to, there, try that. It doesn't want to move forward. Part of what we're doing is learning about Franciscans and how Franciscans work, and that Franciscans, basically, there are 3 themes all the way through this history, this conversation. That Franciscans do things together, that we do things together, whether that's brothers, whether that's sisters, whether that's brothers and sisters as part of the secular Franciscans, whatever it is, if it's Franciscans, there is a sense of doing things together. And that we proclaim the gospel, and especially to those, we like to proclaim it to those who have never heard it. And we also go to the margins. We go to those, we accompany those on the margins. And so that's been the story all the way through all of our missions. Whether the mission was 1493, remember when they came on Columbus's second boat because they wanted to make sure he got back? So they came in 1493. In 1521 to Mexico, to 1539 to New Mexico, to 1598, 1539 is Florida, 1598 to New Mexico, and 1850s to St. Louis. So they are actually this area, not quite to St. Louis in 1850. And in all of this, as they were proclaiming the gospel, as they were accompanying those on the margins, they were always remembering that in order to be heard, if you want to proclaim the gospel, if you want to be heard as you proclaim it, you first have to listen. And so when they listen, they discover that the language of prayer is the language of the heart, is the language of the lullaby. The language of prayer is the language of the heart, is the language of the lullaby. And so that's being there with people, that's being there knowing people, learning people, listening from people, being part of a conversation with people, engaging people. I love it that Pope Francis is now, it's all about synod, and we're to end this together as part of a synodal, or isn't that a wonderful word, synodal? As part of a synodal church, as a part of a church of synods. That synod means accompanying each other, being together, listening to each other, listening to all that we all have to say, because the Holy Spirit is speaking through all of us. That's, I mean, if you're baptized especially. Question.
Okay, I missed that word.
Synodal.
Okay.
Or synod, S-Y-N.
Not sinning, S-I-N-N.
No, not sinning. No. Well, there are a few sinners in the church, I've heard. I could be wrong. I've heard there are a few sinners in the church.
Synod meaning?
S-Y-N-O-D.
Okay.
Synod, which means a gathering together.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So synod and synodal, not well, there are a few sinners in the church. A few, I've heard. But anyway, so this synodal church, a church that accompanies, a church that tries to do things listening to each other. And that enculturation, remember, enculturation is not just language. It's also art and architecture and all those other things. So we had the example in New Mexico of the kiva in the convento, that the architecture reflects the people to whom they had gone. The architecture reflects the people who were there. And so it shares, it's a sharing back and forth, it's a learning from each other, it's being together. So during the first mission period, we have Franciscans represented in all of these different states. Where it's blue, they were French. Where it's red, they were Spanish. Where it's green, that was the very few English Franciscans who were in Maryland for about 40 years. So you've got this representation, but come the end of this colonial era in the 1840s, you've got only one place left, and that's Mission Santa Barbara in California. That is the place where the friars were as missionaries during the colonial era where they remained without a break. So I call it, oops, I don't have it, I thought I had, well, I'm going to show you in a second. It's the hourglass. It's the hourglass that they started as missionaries from on top, and the sand flowed through like the days of our lives, and the only middle place left was Mission Santa Barbara. The sand was on the bottom, and that's when the friars were on the bottom as they come with immigrants. As they come with immigrants then, who are coming in the 1830s, 40s, and so forth. You can see over there how the immigrant explosion happened. You know, it was just an explosion through that 100 years between 1820 and 1920. Look at the figures, the numbers of immigrants in each decade. It was only 128,502 immigrants in all of 1820 to 1830. That was it. That was it. That's all there was. So that's about 12,000 immigrants a year, if they averaged out. Look at 1900 to 1910.
Wow.
8 million immigrants in that 10 years. So that's 800,000 immigrants a year. More than had come in the first 20 years in every year. Every year, more than the first 20 years on the chart. You know, so immigration in the 19th century is this huge, huge, huge part of who we are as people in the United States. It's a huge part of who we are as Americans. Immigration is just a big, big part of who we are. And all through that European immigration, it's a matter both of push, that you've got wars and famines and revolutions going on in Europe. And so people are trying to get away from that, and it's pull, the opportunity for a better life here in the United States. That was the dynamic then. That's the dynamic now. I mean, if you think about it, that dynamic does not change. But sometimes our perception does, and our perception of it can change quite a bit because of what group or groups we belong to. You know, that these waves of immigration have happened. But those waves of immigration are always really bumps. They're always really bumps. I want you to look at this. The Canadians say they don't call people Native Americans. They say First Nations because they are the first nations of immigrants who came to the Western Hemisphere. The First Nations, they came from 10,000 plus years ago. I mean, but we know that the Native American, what we call Native American people, probably came from Europe, or excuse me, from Asia across the Bering Bridge at that time. It wasn't, the water didn't break it, so they could come from Asia into Alaska and then come south. So that's the story. Then starting in the 16th century, you have coming into our part of the world and coming into the United States, all the way from the 16th century, because 1598 is when settlement began in New Mexico. 1570s is when settlement began in Florida. That's 16th century. So you've got that, Hispanics coming, and Latino Americans, those coming from the South into where we are now. That immigration, one way or another, has continued all the way to today. That it's, you know, Hispanic and Latino Americano immigration, they have been constant. And sometimes the immigration was not that they came, but that we went and made them part of our country. We talked about that. We talked about the Mexican-American War. where the United States just took all of this territory where there were 100,000 Mexicans living, and we took it, and they became part of the United States. So Hispanic and Latino Americans from the 16th century to the present. Then the British start arriving, 1607 in Jamestown. The French are arriving by 1600 in Canada and Maine and coming down the St. Lawrence and into the Great Lakes area. And enslaved Africans are being brought. They're being brought from 1619. The first boatload of them are sold in Virginia. So, and they came from 1619 until the 1820s, when the slave trade was finally outlawed into the United States. So there's 200 years when enslaved Africans were being brought involuntarily to what is now the United States. So French, British enslaved. The Irish start coming in the 1830s, drop down, the 1830s, and especially the 1840s and 50s. They never really stopped, but the big bump is the 1840s and 50s. Then the German speakers start coming in the 1840s and all the way to the 20th century. There are more and more German-speaking people who come in that bump. The Polish, the 1880s generally, is when they start coming. You have the Chinese for a limited time initially, because they came, the first big Chinese push was with the gold rush in California in 1849, but in the 1880s, California and then later the United States outlawed the Chinese coming to the United States. That was the first group ever outlawed and said they may not come. And so there are lots of people tried lots of different ways getting around that, but that was the prejudice of the time, that the Chinese were outlawed at the end of the 19th century. Then Italians really started coming about 1885, 1890. And their big push is up until 1920. So it's just about a 30-year push there. Many other Eastern Europeans, and there's a great Jewish migration in the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. Vietnamese who come mid-20th century to the present. And then all of these others, it's not one group, it's lots and lots of others who come. So this is, from Canadians, East Asians, South Asians, free Africans who started coming actually not until the 20th century, that people came of their own will from Africa, and Middle Easterners. So people have come from all over. And you can see the overlap. There was hardly ever any time when only one group was coming. Lots of groups have come lots of times. And there's a pattern to this, and there's a story to this that is almost universal. That's almost universal in our history. And I want to share this one little picture with you to give you an idea of how all of this immigration continually, there are millions and millions of stories. But this particular story is kind of typical of those, and it's going on right now. This story is going on right now. I know two people, a woman and a man. The man we'll call A, the woman we'll call 1. They're husband and wife, and they have 3 kids. Well, the wife came to the United States in 2003 when she was 16 years old. The husband came in 2000. He came a little bit earlier when he was 16 years old. He was still 16 years old. They actually met here in this country, and they met through friends of friends, because they were both from this same little town of 6,500 people in Mexico. So they met, they married, and they had ambition. They had lots and lots of ambition. And so they worked and worked and worked. And the man's brothers, B, C, and D, D is a sister, and then E is the wife, the husband of the sister. So B, C, D, and E count as well. And they're working, and they're working, and they're working, and they're working in a restaurant. They're working in restaurants. That's what they know. That's how they do. That's what they're making a living. By 2008, they are ready, and they struggle, and they have saved their money, and they've done what they could do. They opened their first restaurant in 2008, and then another one in 2009, and another one in 2010, a pizza place in 2011. It didn't last like the Mexican restaurants did. They weren't quite as good with the pizzas. Anyway, okay. So that, and more, the Mexican restaurants, you can see here how they're just opening every couple of years. And it's basically because that's what the tax structure demands. If they're not building a restaurant, the tax level on what they're making goes up and becomes so prohibitive that they're just not making the kind of money they could if they keep expanding. Well, as they expand, two, 3, 4, and 5 are brothers and sisters of the wife. And so they are working in the restaurant. All of these people are working in these restaurants. All of these people are working in these restaurants that they're opening and building. And this year, one of these, I forget which one, whether it was 2 or 3, or maybe it was 2 and 3, they own part of one of the restaurants now. And next year they're opening 2 more restaurants, and other people are joining some of the others who came. They're going to be able, they've saved their money, they've worked, they're going to be owners. This is the American dream. This is the American dream that is still happening. It's still happening. And so here we have 6,500, a town of 6,500 in Mexico. 50 people, more than 50 people at least, have come from that town to work in these restaurants. And they have sent back all kinds of money. They've made money and sent it back. That's what they're doing. And some of them have gone back. Not all of them have stayed. But here's what's happening in the United States from this. They start, 2008 is in a town of 4,000 people in the United States. And the surrounding area, now they've gone, actually now their restaurants extend over like 150-mile radius of that one little town. But the restaurants now have over 50 American-born people working there, with them, for them, part of it. And last year, they paid $1,060,000 in taxes. And half of that was withholding taxes that most of the people who came from Mexico will never get back. That's where they worked, and they paid in the withholding taxes. The company has to, hold the withholding taxes, but the withholding taxes are so that the workers can file their income tax, and where the tax has been withheld from their salaries, and get it back. Except most of them are afraid to file tax returns. They're afraid to file tax returns. And so they don't. So it's, this is what's happening right now. Now, here's what I want you to remember is, this is what's happened. All these people, every one of these have gone through stories of like this, where somebody you knew from your town in Europe, somebody you knew from your town in Poland, somebody you knew from your town in Italy, you went and you joined with them, and you came, you know, all of this kind of thing. It is the engine of success in the United States. It's the engine of life. It's the engine of the economy. This is how it works and how it happens. And it's to be, you know, we are to rejoice in this, that God has shared and that we are called to share a bounty with others that comes from this. And it was with work. It was not, nobody was asking for anything. They were asking to work. They were asking for the opportunity to work. And they worked hard, and look what's happened, you know, with those, in that story. So, these bumps, you know, the bumps, but the waves of immigrants, the way immigrants have come, and the Franciscans rode those waves. They were with the people in the bumps. And so this is, I think I shared this with you last time, that these provinces of Franciscan men, OFMs, TORs, conventuals, Capuchins, all of these got started with immigrant groups in the 19th century. And this is the immigrants. This is how they followed the immigrants. Okay, real quick, what do you think the top symbol is? Is it Irish? Do you think it's Irish? Well, okay, the Shamrock and the Irish, mostly, they stayed in cities. They stayed in cities, and many of them, they stayed in cities on the East Coast, you know, in the Northeast. That's where you see that, lots of green. What do you think the blue triangle is here? What group might that be? Look on the map, I bet you can figure it out.
Germans?
It's the Germans. They talk about the German triangle that is based Cincinnati, Milwaukee, St. Louis. That defines the German triangle, except it went west as far as, you know, into Nebraska and other places to the west. Nebraska and Kansas to the west, a lot of that. Okay? The yellow diamond, any guesses as to what group that might be?
Polish.
The Polish. The Polish that came, and the farmland, they had to go further north to get farmland because they came after the Germans. So they went further north. And actually, if you went up here, you'd find Swedes who came after the Polish in Minnesota and all that, up in that part of the north. So that group. Then, who do you think this might represent? It's a pizza. Italians, of course, the Italians. So the Italians who also did the cities in the Northeast, and actually everybody was on the West Coast, starting with the gold rush and all that. So everybody was in this part of the world, California. But as the Italians took off in San Francisco, they didn't find much gold except they traded, and they opened the restaurants, they opened the stores, they opened those things. And the banks. You know, Bank of America was the Italian Bank of America until it changed its name a while back. So this is the story. Now, all these little symbols are Franciscan provinces, the headquarters of Franciscan provinces that you saw in that previous one. Here we've got two provinces that are in New York City. One is Holy Name Province of the OFMs, and the other is Immaculate Conception of the OFMs. Holy Name was Irish and German, or is largely Irish and German. Immaculate Conception is largely Italian. Then coming west, you've got that very first Irish group, the TORs, who became Sacred Heart Province of the Third Order Regular and Immaculate Conception Province of the Third Order Regular. Then in Pittsburgh, you've got Capuchins who came as part of that Kulturkampf as well. Then St. Louis. Who's in St. Louis? Who's in St. Louis?
You are.
Jim, Ralph,
Chairman.
Damien.
Chairman.
Who's in St. Louis? Yeah.
Chairman.
Sacred Heart Province and the Germans are here. And Cincinnati is also Germans. Now, the difference is Sacred Heart Province is from the north of Germany. Saxony is where most of them came from. Cincinnati was from the south of Germany, the Tyrol, which is Austria, Switzerland, and a little bit of Italy even. But German-speaking area in the south in Cincinnati, German-speaking area in the north, Saxony. In Chicago, or excuse me, that's not Chicago actually, that's Polish. That's the province of OFMs in Pulaski, Wisconsin originally, and in Wisconsin. It's also, I left out one of my little stickers. That's where the Capuchins of St. Joseph province started as well, who were Swiss. Don't ask me how those neutral Swiss got in there, but they're Swiss there in Wisconsin as well. Then this is another Capuchin province in Denver. This is my province in Albuquerque, which started as missions. You're going to hear a little bit about our start later tonight from Cincinnati. Then this is this is St. Barbara province on the west coast that started as it started here in Santa Barbara, and then it was helped along by the friars in St. Louis to keep going. So you've got all of these friars connected to all of these immigrant groups riding the waves.
Will you go back 1 or 2 slides, because there was something that we cited. No, the one after that one. Why are the crosses there?
Oh, they're married. I just was indicating that 1 and A are married.
No.
Oh, that's how it's spreading. These are the ones where these people have now been here long enough that they're buying in. They're becoming owners. That these 2 restaurants, or 3, actually it's 3 restaurants, represent restaurants where it's not just this couple anymore, but they're sharing the wealth and spreading the wealth with others. That's where that took off. That's the first time that they had the opportunity to have other people come in and be part of this and share with them. And so they're, it is brothers and sisters-in-law, but now they've got their own stake. So that's what the cross was to represent, is that by this point, they've reached a point where they can spread the wealth and share the wealth. Okay. So, I mentioned 1858 is when the friars came from Saxony, from North Germany, to Teutopolis. And you know, of course, Teutopolis means city of the Germans, city of the Teutons. And it's over, if you go east from here to Effingham and then south just a little bit, there it is, there's Teutopolis. And when they came in 1858, there were 9 of them. There were 4 priests, 3 brothers, and 2 tertiaries. The tertiaries are what we would today call secular Franciscans, but they were secular Franciscans who were living with the friars and living the same schedule, same life that the friars were working, except they did not take vows as first order Franciscans, because these Franciscans of the first order here understood their vows to mean they could not touch money. They could not touch money. But the secular Franciscans could. And they knew that coming to the United States, where it wasn't just, you weren't just living in one place and you didn't just barter, eggs and chickens for masses and things, that here they would need somebody who could deal with money. And so these 2, Edmund and Francis, came, and they were tertiaries who could deal with the finances. That's what, that's Francis over there, Lupo, that was he was the finance officer. He was the one who could do that and did that for the others. So he did that. Also, you'll note here the age. They were not real young, but they certainly were not old. The average age of these 9 men was just under 35. I mean, they were just under 35, so they were full of energy and life and all of these things when they came. And that's an important thing to remember, because these were volunteers. That's another important thing to remember about these who came in 1858. They were volunteers. They came because of that mission spirit. They came not knowing what they were facing and leaving behind something that was good, leaving behind the religious life they had known, leaving behind everything, but they had that mission spirit when they came in 1858.
So they weren't sent.
Pardon?
So they weren't sent.
No, well, they were assigned, and it was done in dialogue, but they had a choice. They could have said no. They would have probably been quite ashamed if they hadn't, but they could have said no. But so they came because they wanted to. That's as opposed to what's going to happen 17 years later. That's what we're looking at for 17 years later. So these came, and they started coming, and they continued to come. They continued to come for 17 years. One of the first ones who came was Servais Altmix. And Servais was one of those young priests. He came in 1858 from Germany to Junipero. In 1859, he went to Quincy, which was the second house that these friars established. He goes to Quincy, and he helps set up the friary, he helps set up the parish, he helps set up the academy that will eventually be Quincy University. So he's a go-getter. He's one of those go-getters. By 1862, he is 1862. Anyway, he's back in Junipero for the time being, but he is making trips to the St. Louis area and helping out because they had need of German-speaking priests. There were 60,000 Germans and German speakers in St. Louis at that time. So they had need of that, and the Bishop of St. Louis asks, could you start a parish? And so boom, they start St. Anthony's. That's when St. Anthony's comes. And this is a sketch of what it probably looked like, a little church with a little friary attached to it on Merrimack. And then it's Servais and these other two priests, or one's a priest and one's a brother. They're in the little friary in 1862, 1863. What else was going on then? Anything else going on around St. Louis in the 1860s? Oh, the Civil War. So they were all caught up in that. I mean, they were all caught up. That had a tremendous impact on them. St. Louis and Missouri, as you know, was a border area. There were sympathizers. There were people on both sides. There was all kinds of things like that going on. So that Illinois was Union territory, and then Missouri was still Union territory, but it was a border, and so there was all kinds of upheaval, and so to imagine doing all this with, it's kind of like doing all of these things with something like COVID in the background, or something like, that's the kind of thing. They were doing this in the midst of not a peaceful time. Servais, just to follow him a little bit, in the 1870s and 80s, he went to Wisconsin and Michigan to work with Native Americans. That was, again, to go among those who had never heard the gospel. That was a thrust all the way through. And in the 1880s and 90s, he goes to California. He dies in Los Angeles in 1896. And I cannot find a picture of him. I've got to get Denise on this, the archivist over across the street. But I do not have a picture of Servais, and I would love to have one. He's buried in Santa Barbara. I have seen his grave, or his slot in the mausoleum. There were others that 1869 to 1870. Okay, how do you pronounce that name? Any guesses? All you German speakers?
Undershot.
Okay, and Ferdinand Bergmeyer, who we're going to hear more about. and Vincent Hallfuss. Vincent is the first, once 1879 comes, he is the first minister provincial of this new province. But before that, as we were saying, that these are, you can see how they start to spread out. You know, they're in Untitled, which is right about here. Then they go to Quincy, which is right about there in Illinois. Then to St. Louis. Then to Cleveland. Don't ask me how, but they got to Cleveland. Got to Cleveland, Ohio. Then to Memphis, Tennessee. They are spreading out. But then comes 1875, and that boatload, 100 friars on one boat because of the Kulturkampf, and because of the suppression of religious life in Germany. So 1875, and suddenly it's just an explosion in these 4 years of places. Herman, Missouri, which is up here someplace, and Indianapolis, Indiana, St. Peter's in Chicago. Now, you know what the people in Chicago who did not quite understand the Kulturkampf, you know, they didn't quite understand the Kulturkampf and what was going on in Prussia and Germany. But they knew that Bismarck was a strong leader, they knew Prussia was coming up in the world, and they knew that Bismarck had kicked the friars out. And so the response of a lot of the people in the neighborhood, the German people in the neighborhood around St. Peter's, was, if Bismarck didn't want them, we don't want them either. And, you know, they had to win over. They had to win over the Germans in the Chicago area. So that, then Jordan, Minnesota, which is way up here, and Wayne, Missouri, which is further up the river, Joliet, Illinois, right outside Chicago, Columbus, Nebraska, which is somewhere in there, and Chillicothe, Missouri, which is also over in here somewhere, and finally Bayfield, Wisconsin, which is that right there. It's the northernmost little bit of Wisconsin up around Lake Superior, or whichever, yeah, that's Superior. So that was with Native Americans. So that's the first time they got back. 1879 is the first time that those Germans got together with Native Americans. So that was, you know, part of what was going on. As I say, all of this is because of the 100 friars coming in 1875, you know, and so Vincent Hallfuss, thanks to Bismarck kicking them all out, Gregor Jantek, the brilliant provincial in Germany, who made it possible for them to come. He was ready for this. He knew what was happening, and so boom, 1879, their province, that's an independent unit of the Franciscan order. And many people would say that the Franciscans are kind of like a federation of provinces. That's really what we are. It's kind of like a state in the union. So if you think of the Franciscans as the union, the province is the state. Now, this is their Teutopolis. This is the building that they built in Teutopolis. But you've got to understand a little bit about, again, the way they understood their life and the way they understood poverty. I love these. That $15 was how much the guardian, the head of a local priory, could spend. Did you hear that, Bob? Where is it? $15. That's all you can spend.
That's about all he spends.
It's all he's got. But if the discreets, that is, if his council or all the people around him agree that he can go up to $50, anything more than that, and we have to ask Father Tom. We have to ask the provincial for that. They did, because of the bitter cold of Illinois and the plains and all this, and Wisconsin up there, and Minnesota and Missouri, and it is, let me tell you, as somebody who has been living in San Antonio and Santa Barbara for a number of years, the bitter cold of St. Louis, they were allowed to have heat in their rooms, but they were required to sleep in their habits. They didn't have much in the way of clothes. They were required to sleep in their habits, So why would you need sheets if you're sleeping, just on that cornhusk or straw mattress? So that's the way it was. The friars could give gifts of up to $1 if he would let me. I could give, all of you could get $1 Christmas gift. But this is the part that's fun. The regular ration of wine at lunch was 3/4 of a liter. A liter bottle, so that's like that much wine in a liter bottle. And if it was beer instead of wine, it was 1 1/4. I mean, it was more, and that's what they probably did here in St. Louis. I bet there was more beer than wine. And on feast days, it went up by 1/3. Everything was increased by 1/3. So they knew how to live. They knew how to live here in their poverty. And so this is just a glimpse at what was going on. I think I shared this picture with you. These are friars in Santa Barbara in the 1880s. And in the 1880s, all of that Santa Barbara had reduced and come down. It was just these few friars left. And they knew they were desperate. And so Bonaventure Fox, one of them, writes a letter to Rome and says, we're desperate. Can you please help us? And so the decision was made in Rome that house, that St. Barbara house of Franciscans, would become part of Sacred Heart Province, the closest province. And so it became in the United States. So it became part, and then you've got the Recollections. This is Peter Haberlin, who's one of those Irish lads, who had joined the friars in Santa Barbara. And here he is, talking about, in 1872, I was clothed with the gray habit. I remember well the hard times we had before the coming of the German friars, of whom Father Ferdinand was the first. Those were the fathers that came from St. Louis, and how things changed after they came. I've seen the order grow since they took charge, and everything is much different from what it used to be. That the Germans, well, they came and they organized Santa Barbara. That's part of what it was. But they organized it, but it was not just Santa Barbara. This is what Sacred Heart Province did in the West. Old Mission Santa Barbara, then St. Boniface in San Francisco in 1887. Boniface, patron saint of what people? Germans, yes, German people. So they are starting the ministry. These are Germans who are ministering to German immigrants still on the West Coast. St. Elizabeth in Oakland, St. Anthony in San Francisco are same area, same kind of thing. They start missions. They would be right over there in Arizona from a friar in Phoenix. I left out St. Joseph in Los Angeles. But then in 1896, so after they'd been there 11 years, they had men enough there that they established what was called a commissariat, which is a kind of independent, but not quite independent entity within the order. So this is where they were, and during this time, during the late 1800s, remember there was anti-Catholicism all over the country, and that anti-Catholicism started to shift a bit in some places, and in California, they used it as a shift. This is not the friars, but the people of California were using it to say, we have an ancient culture. We're not, in the East, they were saying, oh my goodness, all those people in the West don't know what they're doing because they're brand new, they're barely civilized, etc., etc. But they were saying, look, we have religious who belong to communities that are hundreds of years old. And so it became a very popular thing to advertise the friars in the California missions. It was a romantic image of the friars, tending the cattle in your habit, tending the chickens in your habit, shelling peas in your habit, and the woodwork, the carving, the artistry, all of this, these are he's a famous, George Horton Jones James is a famous photographer in California around the turn of the 20th century. And my favorite is playing croquet in your habit, the novices, this is the young friars. And this is what the friars sell, which they call monks. He says monk's bedroom in Santa Barbara, but the friars' bedrooms in Santa Barbara. And I, by the way, lived in one just like that for a while, but in Old Mission, Santa Barbara. But that's, that sense of making it romantic, making it that the cord machine to make the cord and the farming, all of this is going on. And this also leads to, this romanticization leads to something of an image of Junipero Serra, who has become such a contentious figure in the last 30 years. But Junipero Serra, here he is in early on when California puts him in the statue, his statue in the Statuary Hall of the U.S. Capitol in Washington. He was held up as the hero of California, one of the founder, the mission in his hand. So this is the state government paying for the statue of a friar in the U.S. Capitol. And it's in part based on this whole sense of the mission play. John Stephen McGorty is quite how California began. This was a very popular outdoor drama, no, it was indoor drama, that ran for decades between the 1890s and 1920s in California, with like 1 million people a year or attending it, or 1 million people over the years attending it. But then it's, then people start to take a different look. And so Stephen Hackle here is a current historian, who does a very, very good job of explaining this is a human being. He made mistakes, believe it or not, as well as doing lots and lots of good things, and he had unintended consequences too. But another part of this whole California and the missions is that until recently, every 4th grader in California studied the Franciscan missions. That was part of the 4th grade curriculum. And so when you were when I was living in Santa Barbara, every day during the school year, there'd be groups of 4th graders coming through. It was just, that was the field trip, was to go to your local mission and see it. So this is, it became this kind of an enculturation in a different way of Franciscans and the culture in California. But it's not always that. I mean, that I was talking about, they are accompanying those on the margins. So this is Adrian Weber, Brother Adrian, who designed many churches across the United States. He came from Germany, he's an architect, he's designing churches, and he's designing them to make the people feel good. These German immigrants who are now here in the United States, they're so far away, but they want something. He's giving them something to be proud of, something that's their culture that they're bringing with them that is going to be honored in building these tremendous churches. And so this is actually the rebuilding of St. Boniface, that German church in San Francisco after the earthquake. And so he's rebuilding it here in 1906. He originally built it. St. Anthony in St. Louis, he designed the original one, not the current one, but I think the original one. And then St. Joseph in Los Angeles, the same thing. Sacred Heart in Indianapolis, another beautiful German church that was built between 1875 and 1900, when he was at his height of building all these German Gothic churches. And this is not just a picture. This is the cover of a book that you can buy. No, that you can buy. Mary bought it. Mary has found it online. But anyway, that whole idea of enculturation continued, and this is all part of this growth through the 19th century of Catholicism in the U.S. And so you see you can just see, from 1 million Catholics to 12 million Catholics, nearly 5 million Catholic immigrants in the 19th century, 4,645 parochial schools with 1 million plus students. All this cause and effect of 1884, the Third Plenary Council in Baltimore had said that every parish in the United States that could was to have a Catholic school. And so, boom, you get all these Catholic schools and students and so on. The church saw itself with a mission around 1900. And here is one of the very special things that Franciscans did, not from St. Louis, but from Cincinnati, that I have to share this with you. This is Catherine Drexel, St. Catherine Drexel, who founded the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament to educate African Americans and Native Americans. That was her intention. And so she wants to found a school on the Navajo Reservation in Arizona and New Mexico. But she's not going to send her sisters there for the school until she has men religious there as well. So she goes to Cincinnati and talks with Raphael Hess, the minister provincial there, and talks him into sending friars. And so he sends these 3 friars as the first missionaries among the Navajo. But what they had happen also represents like those that went to Michigan, those that went to Wisconsin, those who went to Arizona. This is again the mission experience of going language and culture and enculturation and architecture. So probably the 2 single most outstanding of the missionaries are this man, Anselm Weber, who went in 1898 and then died in 1923 after 25 years in the Southwest, became the head of all of the Navajo missions and the other Franciscan missions from Cincinnati in the Southwest. He helped found all kinds of things. He helped organize the Navajo people. He instituted the census, which is how they know who they're, that's how they never had a census. And so the friars took the census. They kept track, kept it originally on index cards. Everybody had an index card, who your mother was, who your father was, when you were born, where you were born, etc. And that became accepted by the government as official because there was nothing else, what the friars were doing. So this is Anselm Weber, who helped organize them, and Berard Hiley, who helped preserve their culture. This quote is worth hearing. Here we had a strange people. It seemed to me one had to study their customs, their outlook on life, on the universe, natural phenomenon, their concepts on the origin of man, vegetation, and animals, before one could approach them on religious matters. Here were human beings, intelligent, ingenious, industrious, religious, enormously so. Why then approach them on a "you're all wrong, listen to me" basis? 1900. That's when he went, and this is something that he wrote by 1920, I don't remember. He wrote over, a dozen books on the Navajo language and culture. He was the first one to record the Navajo language with trying to take down the sounds and use, he developed letters. He combining Latin and Greek letters to get the sounds in Navajo that weren't available in English, with just English letters. So he used all this. He recorded their stories. He was, he is the scholar of the Navajo, and to this day, any scholastic research on Navajo culture is going to have him in the bibliography. It's going to have him in the bibliography. And so Berard Hiley, and by the way, he was also never without his cigar. Friars are pretty human life. So this is enculturation at its best, but it doesn't always happen overnight. This is Our Lady of Fatima Church, built in Chinle, Arizona, on the Navajo Reservation, as you see it up at the top, when it was built in the 1920s. Doesn't look very Navajo to me, but the current church is built in the shape of a hogan. About 30 years ago, it was built in the shape of a hogan, and that's the Tabernacle for the Blessed Sacrament, which is under a Navajo wickiup. the covering that the Navajos use in the summer as a temporary shelter, because Christ is in the tabernacle temporarily, so that he can be shared with us and shares himself with us from the tabernacle. So you do have enculturation. It just took a while. So this is to bring this to a close about all of these things. Here is the school that the friars from St. Louis built in Santa Barbara for students to become Franciscans. This was a high school seminary. And here's this very serious looking group of young high school seminarians, about 1910 or whatever it was. But when they were not in studies, baseball. These are American kids. These are American kids. And look at the first someplace you can see the date. It's 1907. Only these are not the kids in Santa Barbara. These are the kids in Cincinnati at the seminary. These are the kids in Santa Barbara at the seminary in 1907. Those two teams could have played each other if they could have made that road trip from Cincinnati to Santa Barbara. I just love that. And I would have put my money on the California kids. They look like they're much more serious about this. So that, enough already. I wanted to leave on that upper note of that coming to America means coming to America in many, many, many different ways. That if this is, getting to St. Louis is about getting to America, is about getting enculturated in every kind of direction. So, questions, comments, refutations of my heresies, anything that you want to? Yes.
Okay, so I'm familiar with Maze Lake, so how many of those types of facilities would have been across the United States?
Let me see if I can go back real quick. To a picture of a map of the U.S.
Because you had the working,
Where's my map of the U.S.? This map of the U.S. Every one of those provinces, every one of these provinces would have had internal schools like Maze Lake. Every one of them. And the only one, I think, that's, although was Maze Lake, what was Maze Lake?
Minor seminary.
Minor seminary?
High,
Okay.
high school and junior college.
High school and junior, so minor seminary in this case was generally from freshman in high school through what we would say sophomore in college.
they
So
all had a facility.
They all had
Wow.
those. They all had those internal schools. And the one in Wisconsin is still there. That's the Capuchin one, not the
Wow.
OFM one. But to my knowledge, it's the only high school seminary left in the Franciscan United States. But every province would have had a high school seminary. That was actually something of a U.S. innovation in the 1860s and 70s, to concentrate on those and to have those. Any other questions, comments? You've survived another hour with me. Oh, there's another over here. Question. Somebody's got a question.
So I was just wondering, in the 1860s, if the German population in St. Louis was 60,000, why would the friars be sent to Indianapolis, which I would imagine had a much smaller population, instead of focusing on the larger city?
Well, it was what Bishop got to them first. The Bishop of Alton, Henry Junker, was in 1858, he knocked on the door of the provincial headquarters in Saxony and said, please send me missionaries. And they said yes. Well, those missionaries got here, and the bishop in St. Louis heard about, oh, there are friars over there, and so I'll get some of them to come here too. So that was it. It was what bishop, that was the pattern. The bishop in Cincinnati, the bishop in St. Louis, or excuse me, in Alton, the bishop in Buffalo, New York, the bishop in Galveston, Texas. All of those bishops sent for missionaries who could come and with their people, their language group, and which was mostly German. Because if they were English speaking, then they went to Ireland. I mean, that was the thing. They would go get Irish diocesan priests, and so that's why Maynooth Seminary in which is just outside of Dublin, I think. I'm not sure where. But anyway, Maynooth sent over 1,000 priests to the United States in the 19th century. Diocesan. Those were all diocesan. Which is why the diocesan clergy in the U.S. in the 19th century, they had an Irish accent, I tell you. But thanks to Bismarck, the religious priests, for the most part, had a German accent. And that was the difference. Yes?
You mentioned Herman, Missouri. Was there a Franciscan presence in Herman?
There was. No. Do you guys remember when you left there?
It was
St. George, isn't it?
St. George.
the early 2000s, I think.
Yeah.
Ambrose German was the last friar there. I had his
The provincial from Germany.
The real experts on Sacred Heart are sitting at that table. I'm just an interloper.
The provincial from Germany liked Herman so much and went there so often, the friars in Germany were afraid he was going to stay there.
Yeah. And actually, Gregor Jatnek might have.
Yeah.
This provincial in Germany who oversaw all of this, he was elected to the General Council in Rome of the order. Couldn't stand Rome, so he just left one day and never went back. Went back to Germany and said, enough of that, I got enough of Rome. So.
We had a presence in Eureka, in Washington, in Herman, Berger, Little Berger, all those places along the Missouri River there. Father Frank was pastor in Eureka.
So,
So,
Theo's from there.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank
next
you.
week, we're going to go out into missions and talk about that. And oh, I should go to the. How fast can I go? There it is. Wait a minute, I went too far. Anyway, so next we're going to go getting around. We're missions and missionaries. We're going to talk about that and the Franciscan sense of that. And then on the 13th, our final time together will be getting ahead, pulling the past and the future together with them, I hope. So
Excellent.
that's what we're up to.